by Anna M. Smith, as told to her by Mrs. H. W. Kellogg, about 1928 or 1930. Anna Smith came to Hawarden at the age of 13 in 1892. She passed away at the age of 91 in 1970. This story tells of the John Wilson family coming from Pennsylvania and mentions the neighbor John Chenoweth, who lived across the road north of the present golf course. It is a touching story of the hardships endured by early pioneers. Mary Janet Wilkins, the niece of Anna Smith, is reader. Pioneer life in Sioux County. Unshed tears stood in Mary Wilson's brown eyes as they looked out of the little four-paned kitchen window through the drizzly January rain. The bare trees on the hillside looked black and soaked. The air was heavy, and Mary coughed, a hard little cough. Quilt patches and blocks lay on the chair and floor beside her, but the hands, usually so busy, lay quiet in her lap. The pleasant, comfortable kitchen had about it the peculiar charm and hominess that some women can give to a room, however little they may have with which to accomplish the effect. The little cook stove shone with blacking, and the turkey wing for brushing the ashes from the hearth hung on the wall behind. The top of the table near the stove was as white as scouring with wood ashes could make it, and the tin dipper in the wooden pail on the table was bright and new. A high-backed wooden rocker, covered with gay patchwork cushions, sat in one corner. In another corner stood a little black walnut crib, and in it, sleeping peacefully, lay little 15-months-old Johnny. The old Seth Thomas clock on the shelf, draped with a crocheted lambrequin, ticked loud and clear. Its hands pointed to 4 o'clock. Mary turned her eyes from the window as the clock struck, and with a sigh she rose to put a stick of wood in the stove. "The boys must fill up the wood box as soon as they get home," she said to herself, and then she heard their voices shouting and whistling as they slammed the gate and came bursting in the door. "I'm hungry," they said, setting down their tin dinner pails and laying their McGuffey readers on the table. Their mother shook her finger to hush them, but it was too late, for the baby was already awake. Tom was a manly, black-eyed boy of 9, and Jim was not quite 2 years younger, so like Tom that people often took them for twins. Going over to the crib, Tom lifted Johnny out and carried him over to the table, where Mother was already spreading molasses on some slices of bread. While they ate their bread, they chatted happily of various little happenings at school. Picking up his reader, Tom showed his mother where the next lesson would be. "I spelled down the whole school today," Jim said, and Mary tried to be interested, but the boys could see that something was wrong. "What's the matter, Ma?" asked Tom. "Are you crying?" "Why, no, son. I'm just tired, that's all. You must hurry now and fill up the wood box and chop some more before Pa gets home. He'll be so tired. They're working the mill men so hard now, and you boys must help all you can." When the boys had gone outside to do the chores, Mary picked up her quilt blocks and patches and put them away. Then, taking down a letter from the clock shelf, she read it again, for the 3rd time. It was from her mother, out in Iowa. The letter began, "Cherokee, Iowa, January 15, 1882. Dear Mary, I can scarcely believe that I have been here a year. I do not feel like the same woman I was when I came out here. I'm a much stronger and happier, too. I do not have those lonely, restless spells that I had after your father died. I tell Bob that these Iowa winds have blown them all away. I hated to leave you and John and the boys back there, but I just felt that I couldn't stand it any longer. Then, too, I feel that Bob needs me here, for he is so busy that he won't take time to cook if he is all alone, and he says Ma's cooking tastes pretty good again. Mary, I've decided that I don't want to go back to Pennsylvania to live. I hope you won't feel too badly about it. Bob really does need me here, and I feel 10 years younger out in this new, fresh country. But it breaks my heart to leave you behind, Mary. I do honestly believe that this climate would help you, too. Don't you think we could persuade John to make a change? I know it seems to him like a big risk and an awful undertaking, but I do believe it would be good for both of you. Land is cheap here. The young men that are homesteading out here are going to be rich someday, for the land is not going to stay so cheap. It's just wonderful what crops of wheat they are raising. Bob has worked so hard to get his quarter all broke up so he can get in more wheat. John will never get ahead back there, I'm afraid, with so little land to farm, and it's so hard for him to work in the mills all winter. I worry about your cough, Mary, and I do wish you could try a year out here. I'm coming back next month for a few weeks to pack my things and see if I can't sell my place. You might be making some inquiries for me, and do talk to John about coming to Iowa. Bob has a place in view for you, not very far from here. The place will be vacant this spring, and Bob thinks he could get it for John. There followed a few more paragraphs of happenings about the little prairie home. Mary sighed again as she read, and this time a tear really dropped upon the letter as she folded and put it back on the shelf for John to read when he came home. Then she picked up the baby from the floor, setting him in his high chair, where he played with a spoon and a tin cup, while she stirred up a Johnny cake for supper. When John came home, dirty, tired, and hungry, he found the chores all done, even old Bess milked, and supper ready and waiting. The light, warm kitchen, with its smell of brown gingerbread and baked beans, was a comforting contrast to the cold, wet darkness outside, and the family was soon gathered about the table. It was covered now with a cheerful red and white checkered tablecloth. A kerosene lamp glowed softly in the center. Johnny nodded in his chair, finally toppling over sound asleep, with his spoon tightly clasped in his hand. Supper over, the table was cleared. While Mary washed the dishes, the boys got out their books and read and spelled to their father. When the clock struck 8, the books were put away, and the boys were soon in bed and sound asleep. Then Mary took the letter for John to read. For 2 hours they sat and talked it over, talked of what would be good for the boys, of their schooling, and so on. Finally John said, "There's a good deal to what your mother said, Mary, about not getting ahead here, and I'd like fine to try it. But to tell you the truth, Mary, I'm afraid to take you out there. Old Mrs. Baker told me one day, after she'd heard you had talked about it, that it would just be taking you out there to die, away from your old friends and neighbors, and other people think so too." John looked away, trying to steady his voice. For a minute, Mary said nothing. Then, going over to John's side, she laid a hand on his shoulder, and when she spoke, her voice was high and clear. "Tut, tut, John, that's nonsense. Who knows but that I'd get well out there? Sometimes they say a change of climate works wonders." And then in a lower tone, "If I do have to go, I'd rather be out there where Mother and Bob are. Let's do go, John." And so all at once the thing that had been troubling them for weeks seemed to be settled, and they felt that whatever came of the move, they had decided the best they knew. A feeling of relief that Mary had not known for months flowed over her spirit, and a little gleam of hope seemed to point the way, where before there had been only doubts and misgivings. John wrote to Bob and asked him to speak for the place nearby for them. Mary's mother came, and the next few weeks were such busy ones that there was no time for apprehensions or forebodings, nor indeed for anything but the necessary preparations for their going. There was not much trouble in disposing of both houses and of the things that they could not take with them. About the middle of March they were all packed and ready, and it was an eager little family that set their faces toward the west. On a raw, windy, blustery afternoon, the train wheezed into the little station at Cherokee. Uncle Bob stood on the wooden platform, his brown buffalo coat buttoned tight around the neck. Keeping one eye on his team, tied to a hitching post nearby, Uncle Bob gave the boys such a hug that they came tumbling down the steps, that they were breathless. The others came down more slowly, each laden with valises and bundles. John carried the baby in one arm, and on the other hand a heavy red and brown carpet bag. They were all talking at once, and the station agent, watching them curiously, suddenly shouted, "Look out for your team!" Bob reached them just in time to grab a rein of each bridle. The whistle of the engine, getting ready to start, had frightened them, and Bob had all he could do to steady them. As Mary stood on the platform, shivering and wrapping her dolman tighter about her, she looked around, up the main street of the little town with its one-story business houses and more pretentious two-story hotel, beyond to the apparently limitless prairie. And in spite of the chill, raw spring wind, there seemed to flow over her soul a new warm spirit of adventure and hope. The fresh, strong breeze seemed already to be blowing away some of her fears and doubts. Her step, as she moved with the others to the wagon, had in it a firmness and a spring that John's anxious eyes had not seen for a long time. Uncle Bob had them all packed into the wagon, wrapped in quilts and robes, and Prince and Pet were stepping carefully along the half-frozen ruts before he told John that he had a disappointment for him. "When I wrote you," Bob said, "I guess I forgot to tell you that March 1st is moving time out here. I should have remembered to tell you. I know April 1st is always moving time back there. Johnson got uneasy when you didn't get here, and I couldn't seem to convince him that you would surely come. So he up and rented to a Hollander from over near Orange City. But don't worry. There are plenty of places, and spring work hasn't commenced yet. The land agents are thicker than flies, and we'll soon get you a place." John's confidence was somewhat dashed, but he could not let Mary see. It was almost dark when they reached Bob's little house, and there was plenty for all to do. Mary and her mother soon had ready a supper of bacon and gravy, eggs, bread, and coffee. While they washed up the dishes after supper and arranged places to sleep, the men did the chores outside and milked the 2 cows. By that time the travelers were tired out, so that when they were finally settled for the night, they fell into a quiet, heavy sleep. When the sun shone in on Mary's face the next morning, she opened her eyes on a world of new hopes, new interests, and new ambitions. She looked out of the window across the field that Bob had plowed. Rich black loam, the sun making dark shadows over the patches of snow in the furrows. The wind had gone down, and there was a look of spring in the sky. After breakfast was over, John and Bob declared that they must go to town and look up a land agent. "There was a fellow over from Calliope yesterday," Bob said. "I was talking with him on the street. His name was Ross. James Ross. I kind of like him. He says land in Sioux County is on a big boom this spring. They're coming in from all over, he says. You know, the Northwestern has built a new line in there, and they've started a new town about a mile south of Calliope. I don't believe Ross went home yesterday. We might find him at the hotel and see what he has to say. You can't believe everything these land agents say, but there was something about that fellow that I liked." They found Mr. Ross at the hotel and spent a couple of hours there with him. At the end of that time, the agent had almost persuaded John that Sioux County was the original Garden of Eden. Mr. Ross described a good many places, but the one that he seemed to think particularly suited to John was an 80, joining the new town of Hawarden on the east. Sioux County was raising splendid wheat, and John was thrilled with the prospect. They went back home to talk it over with Mary, and should she agree, John was to go home with Mr. Ross the next day. As they talked around the supper table that night, John's spirits rose higher and higher. They had a small amount with which to make a first payment, so they decided that if the 80 proved to be all that the agent claimed for it, John would stay there, build a shack, and start plowing for the immense wheat crop that they expected to raise. And so John Wilson came to Sioux County. It was a fine, balmy morning when he drove out with Mr. Ross to see the 80, a beautiful rolling bit of prairie. It seemed to John, as he stood on the highest knoll and looked over the brown, mellow acres, patiently waiting to give and give and give of their richness, that there was where the home of his dream had been all the time. He had a curious sense of having lived here before, and of having at last got home. Before night the contract was signed. The first payment was made, and John's soul thrilled with the pride of possession. He found one neighbor to the north, a man who was to befriend him and his family for a lifetime, John Chenoweth. Arrangements were soon made to secure help, and plowing was started and a small frame one-story house begun. Good luck and good weather favored the work, and by the middle of April the little house was far enough along so that Mary and the boys could be sent for. They arrived on a Saturday evening, April 17, a rainy, gloomy night, at the little northwestern station. John was not there to meet them, but instead they were greeted by the cheery smile and kindly hand of John Chenoweth. Bags and baggage, children and all, were piled into the wagon, while Mr. Chenoweth explained that John was so busy trying to get the last boards of the floor laid so that his family could stay that night in their new home, that he could not even get to the depot. Swinging his lantern up into the wagon, Mr. Chenoweth jumped in, and the mules started. It seemed to Mary a long ride in the dark, jolting and splashing, and once the mules shied and the wagon gave a lurch that frightened them all. But at last they drove up before the little house on the farm that Mrs. Edmonds now owns, and another of the pioneer homes of Sioux County was founded. The days went by, each bringing new duties, bright hopes, anxieties, joys. The baby was a delicate child, but Mary seemed to grow stronger with each whiff of the clean, sweet, light air. The boys were like two young colts, frisking about all day long, roaming the prairies, and finding something new each day. They attended a Sabbath school which the Congregational people held each Sabbath in the northwestern depot, but Mary never left her home during the first busy summer. The wheat came on in the most encouraging way. First a faint tinge, then a deeper velvet, later a green carpet, and finally a billowing sea changing to rich gold. Glorious hopes went hand in hand with the changing fields, and as Mary gathered her eggs and churned her yellow cream, she knew a joy and contentment she had never even dreamed of. About the middle of July, the Sabbath school held a picnic in Samuel Heald's grove across the northwestern track. The boys were wild to go, but at first Mary hesitated. It would be such a long walk in the heat, and it was too close to the river to suit Mary and John. "Don't you trust us, Ma?" the boys asked. So at last Mary consented, and the boys faithfully kept their promises to stay away from the river and to not go near the teams. They had a grand time at the picnic, with a special treat of lemonade and ice cream, and they got themselves safely home. The next day they both had a headache. In a few days more they had a high fever, and by the end of the week they were covered with red spots. They had brought home the measles. The boys soon were better, but the delicate baby took them, and from the very first Mary and John were worried. On the second day of the baby's sickness, John rode one of the horses down to Calliope to get Dr. Brower to come out. Dr. Brower was a little man with sparkling, speaking black eyes, a genial man whose presence in trouble was a tower of strength entirely out of proportion to his stature. Dr. Brower's eyes were very grave as they worked over the baby. He came back in the evening and stayed all night with the frightened parents. Hour after hour they worked, trying in every way they knew to relieve the pitiful suffering, but the little baby grew hotter, and the tiny heart beat faster until the fever raged itself out. Early in the morning, the doctor gently closed the baby eyes and folded the little hands that were not to know or share the joys and sorrows of pioneer life. It was the morning of the 19th of July, and very hot and sultry. John and Mary were worn and spent with the long night of anxiety and grief, and they did only the necessary things. They fed and watered the chickens and the stock and tried to comfort the boys. The day grew more sultry, and clouds began piling up in the west. First big fleecy ones, then darker and blacker ones, until by 4 o'clock even Mary and John were roused from their dull indifference, and they waited in suspense and dread. By 5 o'clock, the merciless hail had come and left the beautiful wheat fields as bare as a floor. Grief, dismay, despair. But work must go on. The next day, Reverend Gilkerson, the Presbyterian minister at Calliope, and his wife, with Mrs. Brower, drove out to offer help and sympathy, and thus began many kindnesses shown the strangers by these friendly church people. Early the next morning, there stood in front of the Leggett Hotel in Calliope a team of spirited bay ponies, hitched to a phaeton, a rather unusual turnout that attracted considerable attention. In the office of the hotel sat the owner of the team, Mr. Dave Brunskill, of Primgar, who with his wife was talking over plans for the day. They had decided to drive out east of town to look at a piece of land that Mr. Ross had asked them to see. They were looking over the country with the idea of locating if they could find just what they wanted. As they drove along east of town, perhaps a mile from the hotel, they noticed over in a patch of corn a few rods off from the road, a couple of men were there who seemed to be digging. "They must be digging out gophers," said Mr. Brunskill. "Guess I'll go over and ask them about the Schuett's place." Handing over the reins to Mrs. Brunskill, he got out and went over to where the men were digging. When he came back to the buggy, Mrs. Brunskill was quite quick to notice the tear that shone in her husband's eye. "What is it?" she said. "Cora, that's a baby's grave they're digging." So it was, the little grave for Mary's baby, the first one to be dug in the new Grace Hill Cemetery. "Where do they live?" asked Mrs. Brunskill. "A mile or so over there," pointing to the southeast. "Let's go over there. Poor things, maybe we can do something for them." A half-hour later they drove up to the dooryard of the sad little home, and who can say how far down the long after years that simple act of sympathy shed its comforting light. Time, in its passing, brought to the Wilsons many changes. Other children came, grew up, and founded homes in faraway places. John went to join the baby John, and finally Mary was alone. Then began her years of needlework, years when the tireless knotted hands fashioned numberless quilts, fascinating and beautiful. Many times she journeyed here and there to visit her loved ones, but always Hawarden was home to her. When she was finally stricken in a faraway state, her wish that she might come home to die was so strong that it bore her through a long journey that seemed almost impossible, back to the dear land of her dreams and memories. And so, on a pleasant summer afternoon, the form of this dauntless pioneer woman was laid to rest beside that of the baby boy of long ago.